Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on the critical barrier to civil war settlement. So last lecture, we saw how there's this commitment problem that occurs immediately following a civil war, where I, as the rebel group, am giving up my arms to reintegrate with the government. But once I do that, I'm now powerless, and so the government can renege on the agreement and give me much worse terms than I was hoping to get from the negotiated settlement, what it actually said on the piece of paper that I signed. And anticipating this, knowing that if I do sign an agreement that that's what's going to happen to me, I continue to fight a war for much longer than I would want to, because I'm so scared that you're going to abuse any sort of peace treaty that I sign. So at the core of this problem is the lack of a third-party enforcer, a lack of, say, a courtroom. In a Western democracy, that's where you would go to if you and your friend got into a disagreement over whether a contract is being followed or not. You would go to a court. The court would see what's on the contract, what the players are doing, and then make a ruling and say this needs to be done, and if this isn't done, there are going to be legal consequences. So this sort of thing doesn't exist in a country that's recovering from a civil war. You don't have a reliable court that you can go and complain to, but there is another option. There is an alternative, and that alternative is a third-party enforcer in the form of a military from another country. So we can have a third party act as an arbiter in this negotiated settlement. So the rebel group and the government will sit down at the bargaining table, they will sign an agreement, that's the peace treaty that ends the war, and they're going to see the terms of that settlement. And then because this third party is going to be physically in the country, they will observe whether there is compliance by both sides to those terms. So they'll see if everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing, or they'll notice, hopefully, if one side or the other is violating the treaty. And if this violation persists over time, then this third party can act by having a military intervention to actually bring in military troops and enforce the treaty the way it was supposed to be enforced by the terms of the treaty, or they might intervene politically by arresting people or by levying economic sanctions to coerce the person who is violating the treaty to stop violating the treaty. So this third-party enforcer is known as the critical barrier to civil war settlement. So if you look down in the video description, I'll link to that article that I'm talking about here. And if we look at the evidence, we look to see what is going on empirically in civil wars, we see that these third-party guarantors of contracts are actually very important to getting a negotiated settlement to work. So if we look at 43 civil wars, the 43 civil wars that occurred from the end of World War II to when this article was written, we see that there were only 6 civil wars that had a third party willing to guarantee the peace, that was willing to go in and enforce the peace, as I was talking about in the last slide. And in 37 other civil wars, there was no such third party. And we see, looking at the probabilities of settlement, the parties were much more likely to settle when there was this third country or this outside power willing to intervene and stop the conflict. If there wasn't a third party available, then they were going to be continuing to fight for a very long time. And in fact, only 2 of those 37 wars ended in a bargain resolution. 35 of them ended in complete military defeat of one side. Now, one concern you might have about this is that there's a bit of selection bias, where maybe it's true that third-party guarantors of these peaceful settlements are only going into countries where they actually expect the settlement to work regardless of their presence. So imagine that I see that the rebel group and the government have negotiated a peace treaty, and I believe that regardless of whether I sit troops in the country or not, that those two sides, the rebel group and the government, are actually going to stick with those terms of the treaty. I'm not even necessary. You might be concerned that the reason that 6 out of 6 bargain resolutions are working when there are third-party guarantees is because they're going in where it would work anyway, and they just want to have the credit of, yes, I was the third party who came in and rescued this other country from the Civil War. I'm so great. When in fact, of course, perhaps this third party didn't actually do anything to affect the peaceful resolution. Now, fortunately, that's not the case. If you go through the article, there are 2 different sources or 2 different reasons that we should not believe that this is actually the case, that there isn't this selection problem. First, in these situations where there weren't any guarantees, there was a lot of negotiation that took place between the parties. So just because all 30 or 35 of those 37 wars ended in complete military defeat of one side doesn't mean that they didn't try to sit down and negotiate. And in some of those cases, they did sit down, they did negotiate, and they came out with an agreement that they thought would work, but they needed a third party to enforce it, and there was no third party forthcoming. And so because of this lack of an enforcer and because of the Civil War commitment problem, those guys continued to fight, and as a result, they fought until there was a complete military defeat of one side. And also, if you look at the 6 cases where there were guarantees, you can actually investigate those and go through the histories of those civil wars and see what the parties were saying at the time and whether they actually believed that they needed this third party to help them out, and they did. So I encourage you to look through that article and convince yourself by reading it that this isn't some sort of selection problem. Now, if you're looking at this, you might think to yourself, okay, third parties, they're really good. They are capable of actually getting bargain resolutions to work. So because there are all of these civil wars going on, the solution to all of our problems is to have third parties intervene. So in other words, we should have had third parties intervene in those other 35 cases, and everything would have been great. The problem, though, is that you can't just say you're going to intervene. You need to meet some special criteria to be an effective third-party intervener. Why is that the case? Well, imagine that you didn't have self-interest in stopping the conflict. Intervention is really costly, right? You need to situate your troops in the country, and if push comes to shove, you're going to have them shoot at people, and they're going to risk death in the process. So if you're unwilling to pay those sorts of costs, you can't enforce the peace, right? If you're going to run at first blood, then I, as the government, am going to anticipate that, and I know that you're going to run at first blood, so I can shoot, you're going to leave my country, and then I'm free to abuse the other side. And if the rebel group believes that's what's going to happen, then the rebel group isn't going to reach that peace treaty. They're not going to agree to those terms because they're worried about this commitment problem. So they're not going to be agreeing to a peaceful treaty if you're not actually willing to enforce the peace if push comes to shove. And there aren't very many countries that actually fit this requirement. So if you're looking for a third-party enforcer, what you might be looking for is a country with a lot of economic investment in your country. If you're trading a lot with another country, war is going to disrupt that. So you might look to these trade partners to say, hey, please come and help us. We'd like to get our economy back and running, and you'll benefit as well because you'll get the trade back as well. Neighbors are a good intervener. So the reason for that is because of all those problems with Civil War spillover and the public health effects. People who are not vaccinated, people who are migrants who are leaving the country searching for shelter to avoid the war, that's costly to you. And so you might want to negotiate or become that third party in the negotiations so you can get all of those all of those refugees back to their homeland. Another category is countries with colonial ties, so that mostly applies to the United Kingdom and France, and also countries with military alliances with those involved in the Civil War. If I'm worried that you're not going to be a very good alliance partner because you're busy fighting with yourself, I might want to go and intervene so you can build yourself back up and be a good alliance partner to me. Another important criteria, military capability. If the new government is going to be able to easily overrun you, then you're not an effective deterrent. Right? You're supposed to be able to stop abuse. If you can't actually physically stop abuse, then you're not a good third party to intervene. Now, the good news here is that most states that are involved in civil wars aren't particularly powerful on the international level, and moreover, the process of fighting is destroying all of their military resources, so the Civil War itself is making them militarily weaker, which means you don't have to be a super strong state like the United States, for example, to be able to effectively intervene. You just need to be somewhat militarily competent in order to be able to do that. Now, the last thing you need is a signal of resolve. The reason is that a third-party intervener might want to bluff that, hey, yes, I am willing to intervene, and so we should have a peaceful treaty be reached, and no one should challenge me, because if anyone does challenge me, I am going to shoot back, and you don't want that. Well, you might not be taking that third party's word if you're the rebel group, because you're really concerned about this commitment problem. And so you might need to see something more credible from that third party to believe that the third party is actually willing to sustain this peaceful treaty and uphold the settlement terms and not run at first blood. Now, there are two ways of doing this. One is to create military tripwires. So you as the third party might go and surround your troops next to a military depot or something like that, something that the government would want to take over in the event of war, and something that the government would now have to shoot its way to, and that's going to risk bloodshed on your side, and maybe that bloodshed is going to cause you as a third party to send more troops in to get revenge on that. Of course, this tripwire thing might not work out so well. So, for example, in Somalia, the first sign of blood for the United States, that goes all over CNN, and very quickly Clinton pulls all the troops out of Somalia. So maybe this military tripwire thing doesn't actually work very well at all. On the other hand, you could try signaling with something known as a costly signal. And costly signaling is very important, and it deserves a lecture of its own. So I'm going to stop here. That ends this lecture, and I hope to see you next time when we talk about costly signaling. Join me then.